Hello and welcome to Coast AM's official YouTube channel. I'm your host, George Norrie. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and of course, on coasttocoastam.com. From the City of Angels, near the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. Welcome to Coast AM. Later on tonight, open lines. Here's what's happening. U.S. officials are concerned that ISIS has people in place to conduct steady attacks. The Islamic State of Iraq, ISIS, the terror group, is under heavy global pressure from militaries and law enforcement organizations. But military and counterintelligence officials forecast no letup in the current wave of international terrorism. ISIS will likely continue, they say, to employ a less centralized approach to attacks, and officials said one driven by slick online messages. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's half-brother was asked to serve as the leader of a North Korean government in exile before he was killed last week during a daring airport assassination. Kim Jong-nam reportedly turned down the offer made by a North Korean defector in the U.S. and Europe. But Kim Jong-un may have been unnerved about the proposition. Let's check in with Charles R. Smith, an expert out there on Asia affairs. Charles, what do you think? Do you think Kim Jong-un was responsible for his brother's undoing? Charles, are you there? No, Charles is not. What Charles probably would have said was, absolutely. Moving on, several hundred activists protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline are under a court order to leave by Wednesday the construction site they've occupied since last year. Protesters at the North Dakota camp, which is near the Missouri River, seemed unfazed by threats of arrest. Activists began their protest last August in a bid to halt the $3.8 billion pipeline that will carry from oil from North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, and in Illinois. And the madness continues. In Pennsylvania, a York County man attempted to attack his father with an axe and slit his throat with a knife during an argument over how much pot pie he ate. Jeez. In Illinois, Boys and Girls Club of Dane County CEO Michael Johnson and other community leaders will introduce a $600 million 15-point plan to reduce violence, while the Chicago Police Department headquarters will open up his doors to that. A Chicago native, Johnson said he is tired of going to funerals, said he has lost more than 50 childhood friends, family members, and associates to gun violence in the city over the last 15 years. John Lott, expert on guns, author, one of them, More Guns, Less Crime. John, I want to ask you if we have any data that all these guns used in these Chicago shootings were legal or illegal. Do we know?
Well, I think they're virtually all illegal. I mean, these people are carrying guns in public. I'm sure they don't have permits to be able to go and carry. So, and these are largely drug gangs that are fighting against each other. And, they're smuggling guns into the city. It's virtually impossible. It's no easier to stop them from getting guns than it is to stop them from getting the drugs that they sell.
President Trump wants to do something, and do something very drastic if this continues. You agree with that?
Well, I think something has to be done. I mean, this problem in Chicago is largely self-inflicted. Chicago has been a mess for decades. I mean, it's hard to believe, but when Mayor Daley became mayor of Chicago, about 67% of murders were solved through arrest. By the time he left in 2011, it was down to 30%. And now, this last year, only 20% of murders resulted in arrests. And there's all sorts of reasons for this, but just look at what's happened in the last few years in Chicago. They've closed down the detective bureaus in the high crime districts. That's not what you do. They've disbanded many gang units. Guess what? The gangs are more out of control than ever after they've done that. And last year, Rahm Emanuel made an agreement with the ACLU that requires every time a police officer stops and talks to somebody, he has to fill out 2 legal pages worth of forms.
That's crazy.
To go each time, and it takes like 45 minutes or an hour for them to do that. So you go and do a few hours of work talking to a few people, and then you spend the rest of the day filling out forms.
Unbelievable. John Lott's website, johnlott.blogspot.com for you. Winds up to 199 miles an hour. Powerful storms continuing to batter Northern California amid concern about levees that could break. Climatologist and expert Dr. Tim Ball with us. Tim, what the heck is going on in California?
Well, it's not just what's going on in California. It's what's going on in Washington with Trump shutting down the climate scandal that's been going on, the corruption through the UN and, of course, the EPA. And so what they're doing is they're reporting, and they've done this for a long time, it's another form of fake news. They take normal climate events, which is what's going on with the storms in California, and present them as if there's something unnatural or that we've never seen before. And, of course, don't forget, these are the people that told you the drought that California was in was never going to end. It was going to go on and on. But of course,
I think it's over.
Yeah, it's over, exactly.
Well, with this controversy about climate change and whether it's a cycle or man-made, I mean, is that going to continue? We don't have anybody agreeing with each other. These groups are against each other. I mean, we need to come to a consensus, Tim.
Well, of course, that's what happens when you make science political, that you can't reach any agreement on it because they're using it for a political agenda. What's been driving it, of course, is the enormous amount of government funding. I mean, the U.S., $70 billion a year going to climate change. Take that away, and of course, most of it disappears. And what makes it worse is that the funding was going mostly to one side of the scientific argument. That is, to those that were saying humans' CO2 was causing climate change, and then the group that were not saying that they were only funding one side of the argument. So what Trump is doing is pulling the money out altogether. You'll see the thing die on the vine.
Is that a good thing?
I think it is a good thing. I think that what we need to do is get the politics out of environmental issues, and that's the problem with the EPA. Because Trump isn't saying, and by the way, I talked to the transition team. Trump didn't tell them to get rid of the EPA. What he said was, look, we need clean air and clean water. What we've got to stop is the use of science and environmental issues for a political agenda. That's what's got to be stopped.
All right, Dr. Tim Ball, thank you so much. Story we have for you at coasttocoastam.com. A half-eaten shark that washed up on a Florida beach, raising questions now about a bigger fish that is possibly lurking in the water. I mean, it's a bizarre story. This was a huge shark, half of it eaten away. How many of us think about the end of our life? And what does that all mean? In a moment, Dr. Jessica Zitter joins us. We're going to talk about extreme measures, finding a better path to the end of life. Okay, welcome back to Coast. Dr. Jessica Zitter with us, MD, is an expert on the medical experience of death and dying. She specializes in critical care and medicine at Highland Hospital in Oakland, California. Graduate of Stanford University and Case Western Reserve Medical School, completed her residency in internal medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, part of the Harvard Medical School as well. Her book, Extreme Measures, Finding a Better Path to the End of Life. What a subject, Jessica. Something that a lot of people are scared about, aren't they?
Yes, I would say that we sort of have a collective fear and denial of death in this culture and in many cultures.
Why do people fear death so much?
You know, I almost wonder if it's evolutionary and genetic that we really just want to live forever. There are Greek myths going back, many years, however many years it is, talking about this perpetual life and what it and this desire for it. So I think it's something that's been with us for a long time.
Now, our fear of death, of course, and there is that tendency, as you believe, to ignore it. Is that very smart to do?
Well, I would definitely say not. I think that, my front row seat in the intensive care unit, I see the results of people ignoring it all the time, and it's pretty devastating. People really end up not knowing what is the power of what we can do with these machines that can keep bodies alive. And many people really wouldn't want it if they knew. And I think we just assume that more technology is going to help us and it's going to be better. But in fact, that's not the case in many, especially for dying patients or patients with serious illness.
What was the catalyst that pushed you into writing Extreme Measures?
I've been writing for years. I've been writing since I was a kid, but I did a lot of writing in my early years of my career when I was when I'd gone into intensive care medicine, and I was very excited at first about the idea of really just prolonging life and saving life, and I started to see that in many cases I was actually causing more suffering, and it was very distressing to me. So I started to write really to deal with my own moral distress. But as I went forward, and if you'll see in the book, I found a new type of medical training that I incorporated into my ICU practice, which is palliative care. And this is really a reasonably new subspecialty, which focuses very much on communication and also managing symptoms, and it's a terrific adjunct to what I do in the ICU. And I started to feel much more hopeful and see a new way of doing this that I felt was working much better for my patients. And so then this book really just came out of that experience of going from this sort of dark place to a much more hopeful place.
What do you think's a better way to die, Jessica? Just to drop over, keel over and die, or to, be in a hospital room and just kind of wither away?
I think it so depends on the person. And what I've learned in my many years of doing this now is, people are pretty different. And what's most important, what I would say is a good death really is one that is most in line with what a particular person's preferences and values are. So I think that's why we need to be communicating a lot more about that particular aspect of life.
As you were studying this, did you come across things where you would make recommendations to people who are about to die?
Well, what I really try to do is not make recommendations. My ideal situation is to educate people about their particular medical condition and about the particular treatments that that are in front of them that might be things that we could do, the benefits and the burdens of those treatments, and then have them decide based on what is really important to them about how they live the rest of their lives. So I don't necessarily like to make recommendations. Sometimes I do, but most of the time people come to it on their own once they've really thought about their own personal values and preferences and understood the realities of what lie before them.
What do you think about prolonged living through life support?
Let's put it this way. I would say we know from data that we do it all the time. There are many, many people, and a rising number, especially now as the baby boomers are starting to, age, that more and more people are dying this way. We've got this term called chronic critical illness, which is quite a large population of people, the chronically critically ill. And these are people who really do have profound debilitation and require, at the very least, institutional support until they die, or many remain tethered to machines. And this is in my opinion, a public health crisis, and this is a big part of why I do my advocacy. I really feel like people need to know about this. But the other piece of data that we have is that most people don't want that. If you look at surveys, and there's lots and lots of surveys, and more coming out all the time, people want to die at home. 80% of people want to die at home, but what percentage do you think die at home?
Not that many.
20. It's a very, very low percentage. The other thing that's interesting is that, we know that when patients have access to more information about end-of-life issues and about the options ahead of them, they always choose, most patients choose a much lower level of technological intervention. And, in fact, they don't die sooner. And so there's quite, I think that we know that people don't want to die that way, and more people are dying that way, and I just think we need to raise awareness about that.
Well, especially when they prolong it, because if that's the way you're going to stay alive, with an apparatus on you, and you cannot live without it, who wants to live that way, Jessica?
Well, and it's a very important point what you just said, with an apparatus on you. That, let me describe it a little bit more in detail, because I think it's important for people to understand what it means to have, for example, chronic critical illness. It means that many of these patients are attached to breathing machines, and by that point, it's more of a permanent connection through a tracheostomy through the neck. They usually have feeding tubes that go into their stomachs. They're usually in a bed, lying flat. They're often have their arms tied down because dislodging tubes, which is a very risky and dangerous thing. So a lot of these people have their arms tied down, and you can imagine that patients, their families, as much as they love them, can't really stand vigil for that. To stand at the bedside of somebody like this is I think not only extremely difficult from a physical and financial perspective, but in terms of an emotional. And so a lot of these people just end up really dying in this very isolated environment of an institution attached to machines.
The name of the book, of course, is called Extreme Measures, Finding a Better Path to the End of Life. Now, is there indeed a better path to the end of life? I
absolutely think so, and I have seen it, and, my book is filled with stories of people who've really taken their own lives into their own hands instead of going along what I call this end-of-life conveyor belt. And to me, it's extremely uplifting to see people who have said, no, I want to take control of this and do this my way instead of just going down this default path of, high-tech treatment, which is what we do. And I've seen it shift many times and really go from something that could have been a really highly medicalized death to something that's much more home-based and comfort-based and family-oriented. So to me, that's a success. But for some people, some people really feel that even if they understand all the details of what this chronic critical illness could look like, they still feel that they would want their bodies to be kept alive. And I respect that. We do that a lot. Most of the time we do it without people really telling us to do it. We do it by default. But certainly if someone said to me, this is really important to me, that I be kept alive as long as possible, I'd say, okay, we in this day, in this modern medical era, we will do that if you ask for it. And it's not my choice, but that is some people's choice.
Have you ever seen a case, Jessica, where they kept somebody on life support and then miraculously they recovered from whatever ailment they had and they didn't need it anymore?
It's extremely rare. I've seen it a few times in my career. It's usually in the context of a reasonably young person who's in a coma either from an accident or a very serious infection. I've never seen it happen in somebody who, for example, has terminal cancer and who has been dying and come in, with very serious illness and then gotten sicker and sicker and gotten into the intensive care unit. I've never seen those kinds of patients turn around and all of a sudden, recover to the point that they're going back to their lives.
With this kind of end-of-life treatment, what do most doctors say about this? Would they be in support of what you've just said?
It's an interesting question, and I looked at the data on this. Doctors don't want to die this way. There's a study that was done in, I think, 2013 out of Stanford, surveying a bunch of young doctors about what their preferences would be if they had a terminal illness, and 88% of them said that they would want to be made DNR, which is do not resuscitate, which means that if when it comes time that their organs start to fail, let me go peacefully. Don't put me back, on aggressive machines and bring my body back on machines. And yet, if you look at another study that looks at a bunch of geriatrics practice in Canada, where there were about 500 surveyed geriatrics patients in this practice, only 8% of them had ever had conversations with their doctors about this do not resuscitate. So doctors don't want to die that way, but their patients don't even have the chance to opt out.
I left my children a notarized statement. I've got three kids, and it was, do not keep me on life support. And I said, 2 of you can outvote the third, so you have to have 2 votes of the 3 of you. And that's what I asked for. Now, what do you think of that?
Wow. I think you're a pretty progressive family that you're a pretty progressive dad that you'll have this conversation. It's not a common thing for families to talk about, and it's really a gift to your kids to give them any sort of sense of who you are and what's important to you, because I see so many families where, dad has something happen and probably won't be able to speak to the kids again, and they just stand at the bedside with no idea of what dad would want.
Exactly.
And so to have something is lucky.
Jessica, we're going to come back and talk more about your work, Extreme Measures, Finding a Better Path to the End of Life. Next hour, we'll take your phone calls with us, and maybe you can share your stories of end-of-life stories that you've gone through. We'll be back. And welcome back. Dr. Jessica Zitter with us, author of Extreme Measures, Finding a Better Path to the End of Life. What do your colleagues say about this, Jessica?
In the beginning, I think there was a little bit of confusion about merging these two subspecialties together. They seemed like a lot of people said that they were very, very unrelated. In fact, I remember very early on, way before palliative care even became an official subspecialty, somebody said to me, "I think you're selling your ICU patients a false bill of goods if you practice palliative care medicine." And as if somehow that it would make me less likely to want to save someone's life, which it simply does not. I mean, I'm an avid and passionate lifesaver. I love using my tools and technology to save patients and bring them back if I can. But I think I've been thrilled and excited to see, especially over even the past several months. I mean, I feel like it's just ramping up so fast, this incredible interest in the medical world and the healthcare world in general, to understand that this is a critically important part of what we do, which is to communicate with our patients.
It's critical indeed.
Yeah.
Do you think they should be teaching death and dying in our schools?
Well, yes, I do. I just wrote a piece. I don't know if you might have seen it in the New York Times yesterday. Came out in the Sunday Review about teaching death education to high school students.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that we see death as a taboo subject, much in the same way that we see sex education as a taboo subject. And we know that, the data show that that students have actually really benefited from learning about sex education, a decreased risk of pregnancy, decreased risk of sexually transmitted diseases, and that's why it's actually been brought into our public schools and taught widely. And I think you could really make the same argument for death education. People don't know anything about death. And they're, as I've explained, as we've been talking about, really, they're vastly unprepared for it. And I think that it's a sort of a civic responsibility for us to teach people about what happens as people approach the end of life, because I think people would make very different decisions, or make decisions to start with, that they're not making right now.
At what age would you start?
Well, it's a really good question, and I have to be honest. I mean, there isn't a lot of death education happening right now.
No, there's not. I mean, yeah. I didn't get it in school, that's for sure.
Me neither. I mean, I remember when I was, 15 and my grandfather died, my parents, said that they thought I should stand outside of the cemetery because it would be too upsetting to go to the graveside. And I think, I don't know the actual age. I'm guessing. I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say it's sometime in high school. The school, we taught this first death ed class just a few weeks ago at my daughter's school, and we taught to their 9th grade health class. And I have to say, I was a little nervous about it. I was worried that, was someone going to run out of there screaming? Was it going to, upset kids? And I was really shocked to find that these kids were rapt. I mean, they were a little tentative, but they were rapt. They wanted to know more. They wanted to hear about it. And when they started getting going, and we started teaching them how to play this card game that really is about figuring out what your preferences about living would be, and they were very engaged and very interested.
My father would be 94 years old tomorrow, Jessica. 94. He died when he was 88 years old. I ended up doing the radio show that night. It was a quick, sudden thing. They took him into the hospital where he had fallen, and they told him that they had to operate on the back of his neck to fix a bone that apparently he had broken. And he looked at them and said, no, closed his eyes and died. Just like that.
Wow.
Just like that. And,
wow.
Immediately after that, after the show, we flew to Detroit, had the funeral, And, it was difficult because I actually thought the guy could go on forever. But then when you realize 88 years old is a pretty good run, isn't it?
It sure is. It sure is. It sounds like he lived
I should be that
right
lucky.
up to the end.
Yeah, I should be that lucky. But we were really never trained about death and dying. I mean, these things just happen. Thank God if you can get a good funeral person at a funeral home, if that's the way you go, who can take care of so many things, because, I mean, there are so many different things that are required. Not only does the person die, but then you've got, their personal business and artifacts. And, I mean, it goes on for months after that, and they don't teach you that either.
Right. It's true. And, the part that I deal with is the medical part, the part that's in the hospital.
Right.
But you're right, there's a whole other level of things that happen. But both of those categories, whether it's the healthcare instructions and directions, whether or not to use machines, as well as these financial preparations and who's going to get what and how is that going to all happen, all of these things can be really a lot more controlled and done in a way that's going to make a lot more sense and a lot more people happy and less chaotic if they're thought about earlier on, and instead of, the way we do it, we plug our ears and say, no, you're not going to die. I don't want to talk about that. So planning. We're
with Dr. Jessica Zitter, and her book, of course, is called Extreme Measures. Where can people get your book, by the way, Jessica?
I think you can get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and in most bookstores now. It just came out today.
Perfect.
So.
Great timing.
Yes.
And, of course, your website we've got linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Where does religion play a role in helping people cope with death and dying?
It's such an interesting question. There are so many variables, including religion, culture, language, personality, your family dynamic, so many different variables that act on a person and create a person and their own preferences and values and their own decisions, that it's hard to say that religion per se affects people one way or another. I've met many very religious people who would absolutely not want to be kept alive on machines and would feel that it was going against God's will if it was their time to die to keep their bodies alive on machines. And then I've met very religious people who feel the exact opposite, that you need to keep the body alive as long as possible with the possibility that God might do a miracle. And so I don't even know that it's religion that's the most predictive variable, if that makes sense.
When you talk about adding quality to a patient's final phase of life, exactly what does that entail?
It's so unique to the person. I remember, in my book I write about a story. There's so many stories that I write about ways to enhance quality and examples that I've seen. For example, I talk about the Zen Hospice Project, which is this wonderful hospice that exists in San Francisco, which I went to visit, and just really about making people's lives as high quality as possible, including letting them taste little tastes of food, not forcing food on them, because as you know, people as they approach the ends of life don't want to eat, and it can also be actually dangerous for them to eat, but just letting them have little tastes on their tongue of food that they might like. And they have this wonderful chef who really goes to such great efforts to create these little tiny masterpieces for people just to smell. They don't even have to eat it. I have a friend whose mother was dying. She was very, very proud about her looks, and she always, and before she even got sick, she would say, please don't let any hairs grow on my chin if I'm in a coma. It was a joke, but then when she really was done,
she meant it.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, she meant it, didn't she?
She meant it, yeah. And so we were able to do that for her. And it's really personal. It's really personal what people want.
Do most individuals that are at this point know they're dying?
It's so, a lot of people seem shocked when you first tell them, but they're often not. And in some ways, one of the things I see so frequently is you give somebody bad news and they are shocked, but then very quickly, whether it's in a few hours or the next day, there's some relief that you see, because people who are dying know that their bodies are going on some level. And with all of the activity and the hustle and bustle of putting in catheters and doing this and putting in, running around in the intensive care unit, there's this message that we send to people that, we can actually keep you alive, and we're going to, and so when we actually say to them, no, you're actually dying, it's so clear to them because they've been feeling like they're dying. And it's sad and it's distressing, but once those emotions have been felt, there's a certain type of resonance that comes in that these people say, well, you know what, this makes sense, and there's a certain peace that comes with that in many cases.
As a doctor, with most people who are at this stage of dying, is prolonging their life the smart thing to do? I mean, I know that's what the doctors have to do. They've been channeled to do that, unless you were Kevorkian. Mm-hmm. But isn't it maybe better just to let them fade away?
It's a tough question. We don't. We default, if we don't know, if we haven't had an opt-out, if someone hasn't said, no, this is not what you would want, or if the patient herself hasn't said, do not resuscitate me, or has a pulsed form, which we should talk about, then what we do is we keep people alive on machines, and it's very tough, and it's hard to watch sometimes because I feel, and I think a lot of my colleagues and healthcare professionals feel, that we sometimes are doing something that's akin to torture. Taking a body that's trying to die
and keeping it alive. Yeah.
Doing everything to keep it alive. What
about somebody in a coma?
Well, there's so many reasons why someone might be in a coma. For example, it could be that somebody had a major head injury.
Mm-hmm. How many people come out of a coma?
It's rare, but it depends on the etiology or the cause of the coma. For people, it's a very rare phenomenon. I mean, for somebody to be in a coma for any prolonged period of time, and with every day that they're in a coma, it becomes less likely that they'll wake up.
I mean, I remember the case of Ariel Sharon, the former Israeli prime minister. He went into a coma, and, they kept him alive for years. I mean, years. And he finally died. I actually thought he was going to go on forever as well. But,
yeah.
When you're in that state, do you dream? Do you know what's going on? Do you hear people? Who knows, huh?
It's hard to say. There's, different studies that have been done, looking at MRI, functional MRIs, and there's some question about whether or not people can still hear and whether or not the parts of the brain. But it's so complex. There's so many reasons and causes that someone might be in a coma that you almost can't make a generalization about those kinds of things.
I mean, when you go to bed, you're like you're dead. That's it until you wake up. And is it a little like that? Is dying somewhat like going to sleep? I
wish I could tell you. I really don't know.
Well, if it ever happens to you, call us on the other side one day. When you get to be a real old person or something. But
I don't think anyone really has the answers to that, those questions. But what I do know is that we want to, keep people as comfortable and as calm as we can, even if they are in a situation where they're attached to machines. And we do our best to think about whether or not they can hear anything and to try to keep the room as calm and peaceful as we can.
I know you're a medical doctor. You're very scientific. But in these studies of people who have died or places you've been where you maybe have witnessed this, have you ever encountered anything that you would call supernatural or very bizarre or strange with their death?
The only thing I've seen is there does seem to be a phenomenon, and honestly I haven't studied it and I don't know the data, but when a patient is hanging on for a period of time, once their family kind of all gets to the bedside and someone might even say, it's okay, you can go, that they die. This has happened in several cases that I have been involved in, that people sort of give permission to the patient to die, and then they die shortly after. Do I know if that's really connected? No, I don't. But I feel like I've seen that happen at times.
But you haven't seen the soul leave the body or anything like that, have you?
No, I have not, but it's so funny because you're the second person who's asked me that in the past week, so it's interesting. I haven't, though. I definitely have not.
The Carrie Fisher, Debbie Reynolds situation, I found sad and fascinating at the same time. I think the stress and the sadness of Carrie Fisher's death caught Debbie Reynolds, and she died because of that. What would you think?
You know, it's interesting. I think that's a very good possibility. There are a couple of different types of conditions that can arise from profound stress and sadness. There's a certain type of cardiomyopathy where the heart isn't functioning well enough it's called takotsubo, and it basically is the result of profound stress, sometimes emotional, psychological stress on the heart. And I have seen that a couple of times, so I certainly think it's a possibility.
Don't you think with today's technology it would behoove a lot of people to get all kinds of medical tests? I mean, you can literally lighten up your arteries now in your heart without having to do an angiogram, and you could see if you have any blockage. You can get blood tests to determine, how your chemical balance is. You could do all these things. Don't you think it would be very wise for people to do things like that? I mean, somebody shouldn't be dying of a heart attack, and they say, well, his arteries are all blocked up. You should go in and get a test now.
There's no test. I mean, first of all, let me tell you, one thing we know is that in many, many cases, there is this over-diagnosis problem that can cause very serious morbidity and mortality. In fact, all of these, using this technology, whether it's for diagnostic or treatment purposes, it seems like this magic pill. It seems like we've got this we've got this technology, we might as well use it. And some people call it the technological imperative. But it's a big part of what's gotten us into trouble. We really sort of think that there's all of these scientific answers to keeping us safe, keeping us healthy, and I can tell you that there really isn't any magic bullet in medicine, at least that I know of. There may be, improving diagnostic things to do, but they're not so striking that, if they were so striking, they would be recommended now by Medicare and the FDA. But we really don't have anything that, to my knowledge, that is going to sort of be a magic bullet to keep someone healthy and alive forever. I think what we have to do is be really a little bit skeptical about the way we think about technology, because I think it's gotten us into a lot of trouble.
What's more important, educating the dying about death or educating the family members about the person who's dying?
Well, that's a great question. I really think that, apropos of my death ed in high school suggestion, I think that when we start bringing this into the conversation in society, and we start normalizing this and acknowledging that actually we are all going to die, and this is something that we should all be prepared for, both as individuals and as families, so that we can speak for for our loved ones if they can't speak for themselves, then I think that it's really important that we all be educated and encouraged to have these conversations together.
We're going to come back and take your phone calls with Dr. Jessica Zitter. So if you have stories about the dying, share those with us, or just plain questions. Thank you for listening to Coast AM on our official YouTube channel. I'm your host, George Norrie, and don't forget to visit the Coast Insider membership area on coasttocoastam.com, where you can access our past, upcoming, and classic shows.